Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well.
Chapter 4 of Pierre Hadot's book, Philosophy as a Way of Life, is titled Ancient Spiritual Exercises and, in quotes, Christian Philosophy. And I think that the quotes are there in part because Hadot wants to signal that this notion of Christian philosophy is kind of a debated and debatable topic. In fact, there were debates in the 1930s primarily, although they continued on in some circles well into the 40s and 50s about the applicability and nature of this term or concept, Christian philosophy. And Hadot realizes that this is a somewhat contested issue, and he's interested particularly in how what he is calling spiritual exercises figure into this. How does Christianity assimilate exercises that are coming originally from pre-Christian pagan philosophies like Platonism and Stoicism and among others? So there's a little bit of discussion at the beginning about how Paul Rabot is getting some things right and getting some things wrong by looking at Ignatius, so we're talking about somebody who's kind of a later Christian author's spiritual exercises. And Hadot wants to say that Christian spiritual exercises took on new meaning by virtue of the specific character of Christian spirituality. So being inspired, for example, by the death of Christ, the Trinitarian life of the divine persons, but they're not just moral exercises, as Rabot was saying, and he says that if you call them that, you're going to misunderstand their importance and significance. So he goes on and he says, these exercises have as their goal the transformation of our vision of the world and the metamorphosis of our being. So they have not merely a moral, but an existential value. We're not dealing here with a code of good moral conduct, but with a way of being in the strongest sense of the term. And so he says, in the last analysis, the term spiritual exercise is the best one because it leaves no doubt we're dealing with exercises that engage the totality of the spirit. So spirituality, spiritual exercises, totally connected with each other all the way from the beginning in the Christian community with the documents that we have. And then he's going to talk about philosophy. And he says that, from the first centuries of the church's existence, Christian spirituality was the heir of ancient philosophy and its spiritual practices. So Christians, not every single Christian was studying philosophy, of course, or closely connected fields like rhetoric, but the people who are shaping its thought and its practices, who are directing the communities, many of them have had a lot of exposure to and even intensive study of the various philosophical systems, schools, traditions of antiquity. Platonism, going through all sorts of iterations, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, Cynicism, just to name a few. And we see that a lot of the early Christian authors are incredibly engaged with pagan philosophy, right? So how does this actually figure in, he's going to say? So he tells us that if we want to understand somebody like Ignatius Loyola later on and his exercises, then we need to think about this in terms of how spiritual exercises were preserved and transmitted by an entire current of ancient Christian thought. That current, namely, here's the key term, which defined Christianity itself as a philosophy. So, sometimes you get Christians who will take up, one little line of Paul and say, oh, philosophy, no good, stay away from that. And Paul's not actually saying get rid of all philosophy. He's just saying a philosophy that winds up being an obstacle. Paul himself has quite a bit of training and in things that, broadly speaking, are philosophical. And so Hadot is going to go on, and he says, in order to understand the phenomenon under consideration, the fact of ancient spiritual exercises being assimilated to Christian spirituality, it's essential to recall there was a widespread Christian tradition which portrayed Christianity as a philosophy. So that is really quite important, that as Christianity is not just a religion. The notion of religion and philosophy as being two separate things, very, very modern idea. Not really an ancient idea, in particular if you look at Stoicism or Platonism, right? You're going to see all sorts of discussions about God and the gods and spiritual life and things like that. So he says, this assimilation began with those Christian writers of the 2nd century who are usually referred to as apologists, in particular with Justin Martyr, who actually writes an apologia that is, at least as the text, addressed to Marcus Aurelius, saying, hey, these Christians aren't so bad. Look at, they actually are doing things that legitimate philosophy is doing, and we all buy into that. And he's going to go on, this is Hadot, and he says, to mark its opposition to Greek philosophy, they spoke of Christianity as our philosophy, or as barbarian philosophy. But, now this is a really key point, they did not, however, consider Christianity to be just one philosophy among others. They thought of it as the philosophy. So there's a contrast here between as and the, right? The philosophy that is the best philosophy, that realizes what philosophy has to offer more than any of its predecessors or current rivals. And he goes on and says, they, meaning these early church writers, believed that what had been scattered and dispersed throughout Greek philosophy had been synthesized and systematized in Christian philosophy. And there's a nice metaphor for this that ties in with both Christian spirituality and with ancient philosophy. Each Greek philosopher they wrote had possessed only a portion of the logos. Now, the logos, particularly capitalized, is the word, the reason, you could call it transcendent system of whatever it is that we want to say is the object of philosophy. Christians were in possession of the logos itself. How? Incarnated in Jesus Christ. And this is coming in part from the Gospel of John, right, where it says, in the beginning was the Word. That's hologos, right? So this is a term that has great meaning, a number of different meanings in pre-Christian ancient philosophy, and it comes to take on even more meaning within Christian thought. So he says, if to do philosophy was to live in accordance with the law of reason, then Christians were philosophers. Why? Because they lived in conformity with the law of the divine logos. And he's going to bring up a number of different examples. Clement of Alexandria. If you've never actually read his work, you actually should check him out. He's a very, very interesting early Christian author. And one of the points that Clement makes that Hadot doesn't talk about here is that Christianity is a gnosis, a kind of, living knowledge or wisdom. It's a philosophy. And there's different preparations for it. So for the Jewish people, there was the Jewish scriptures. For the Greeks ancient Greek philosophy, and particularly Platonism and Stoicism, provide a preparation for the gospel that's just as legitimate as the old law of the Torah. So that's Clement of Alexandria. What Hadot brings up is that he establishes a close link between philosophy and paideia, by which he means the education of mankind. Already within Greek philosophy, the Logos, or divine pedagogue, had been at work educating humanity. But Christianity itself, as the complete revelation of the Logos, was the true philosophy, which, quote, teaches us to conduct ourselves so we may resemble God and to accept the divine plan as the guiding principle of all of our education. And then he brings up other philosophers, theologians as well, Origen, and the people that are influenced by him, the Cappadocian Fathers, Basil, Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa. It also shows up in John Chrysostom, and we could mention others, Lactantius as well, as being great examples of this. All these authors, he says, speak of our philosophy, of the complete philosophy, or of, quote, the philosophy according to Christ. So at least in ancient times, in the several, first centuries of Christianity, as it is spreading as a religion, there's this very, very strong tradition that is developing of considering Christianity as a philosophy, not merely as a way of living or as a religious orientation. He's going to go on, and he raises a really interesting point, a polemical point, right? Because all the way down to today, we have people who are like, oh, Christianity and philosophy, they can't mix at all. Original Christianity is coming out of this completely religious framework of Judaism, and it shouldn't be sullied by bringing in Hellenistic philosophy, all that stuff from the Greeks, right? And that was quite popular in the 19th century, goes on into the 20th and 21st century. And Hadot is, he knows better than that, right? People who say that sort of thing either are prejudiced or they're ignorant of the history of Christian thought. And he says, you don't have to go to early Christians for this. You can go to Philo of Alexandria, right? Who is a Jewish philosopher, also influenced by Platonism and Stoicism, Platonism more. And he says that this tradition in portraying Christianity as a philosopher was an error, almost consciously so, of a tendency at work in the Jewish tradition, particularly in Philo of Alexandria, who portrayed Judaism as a patrios philosophia, the traditional philosophy of the Jewish people. Same terminology used by Flavius Josephus. So this is already there going on. And then we move on to monasticism. Now, monasticism is not something that is unique to Christianity, certainly not to Western Christianity. We have monasticism happening pretty much everywhere, as far east as we're going to go. But Christian monasticism comes to be viewed in the late antiquity, early Middle Ages, as a kind of perfection of Christian life. It's better to be a monk or a nun than to be a layperson. Why? Because you have more time on your hands for praying and improving your character and engaging in spiritual exercises. You have less attachments to family and political position or things like that. And he's going to go on and he says that monasticism could also be portrayed as a philosophia. He says from the 4th century on, this is exactly how it was described by church fathers such as Gregory Nazianzen, Gregory of Nyssa, John Chrysostom, Evagrius Ponticus, and we might also add a few others in here as well. Somebody massively influenced by Evagrius Ponticus, somebody incredibly important for the development of monasticism in the West. And that is John Cassian, right? So these authors are all talking about Christianity as a kind of philosophy through the monastic orientation. And he says it was still current in the 5th century, for example, in Theodoret of Tyrus. A little bit later on, he's going to say, this doesn't stop in the Middle Ages, and he gives several examples here. He quotes Jean Leclerc, the great monastic author, Benedictine author of the 20th century, who showed that the monastic life continued to be designated by the term philosophia through the Middle Ages. A Cistercian monastic text tells us Bernard of Clairvaux used to initiate his disciples into the disciplines of celestial philosophy. Bernard of Clairvaux, now we're on the cusp of what's called the High Middle Ages, right? So this is going on for quite a while, even with the rise of the universities and scholasticism. John of Salisbury maintained it was the monks who philosophized in the most correct and authentic way. And so Hadot is going to say, so there's at least one tradition, one community, vast community, going on for centuries and centuries within Christian thought, which views Christianity as a philosophy, as the philosophy. And then he's going to go on and say something else that's quite important. He says the importance of this assimilation between Christianity and philosophy cannot be overemphasized. Let us be clear on one point. There can be no question of denying the incomparable originality of Christianity. So Christianity is not just taking on philosophy in order to become philosophy. It's really transforming it in the process by what it also brings to the table. He says that we have to emphasize the specifically Christian character of this philosophy, the care Christians have taken to connect it with the biblical and evangelical tradition, and the tendency to assimilation was confined within historical limits, always linked more or less closely to the tradition of the apologists and Origen, but it did exist. Its importance was considerable, and, coming back to the key point, its result was the introduction of philosophical spiritual exercises into Christianity. Christians weren't just saying, we'll take on premeditatio malorum from the Stoics and make it our own. No, they're taking it in and making it something that becomes determinately Christian. We might actually think about, for example here, the adoption of Seneca as a sort of honorary Christian, albeit through fake letters between him and Paul, or the use of Epictetus's Enchiridion within the monastic communities, substituting Christ for Socrates in the text and monk for philosopher in the text. Going on, he's going to say, along with its absorption of spiritual exercises, Christianity acquired a specific style of life, spiritual attitude, and tonality, which had been absent from primitive, very, very early Christianity. And he says that this is really important. Why? Because it shows that if Christianity was able to be assimilated to a philosophy, there's a reason for this. Philosophy itself was already, above all, a way of being and a style of life. So it makes sense that Christianity could be viewed as philosophy if that's what you understand philosophy to mean. He's going to say, in antiquity and in the monastic Middle Ages, philosophia was not just a theory or a means of knowledge, but something more, lived experienced wisdom and a way of living according to reason. So if you actually have that conception of philosophy, which Hadot has demonstrated, among many other people demonstrating this, that was what ancient philosophy was fundamentally about. It was not just a tool. It was not just about theory. It was about living out a certain type of existence. Even with the Aristotelians, the perhaps most theoretical, Hadot argues that no, they are actually trying to live out a certain way of life. Well, then Christianity can, as it comes on the scene, take that in, synthesize it, and develop something new, which gives a new home for these philosophical exercises or spiritual exercises, as Hadot wants to call them.